I want to tell you about a park. Shocking, I know, but I want to tell you about a special park, a unique model for conservation that completely redefines what it means to be a park in the first place. You can live in this park, you can work in this park, and you can play in this park. This park contains almost 6 million acres of land. It's bigger than Yellowstone, Yosemite, Glacier, and the Grand Canyon combined. It contains 2,000 miles of hiking trails, 3,000 lakes, and 30,000 miles of waterways. 10 million people visit it each year, while less than 150,000 call it home permanently. This is Adirondack Park. My name is Cameron. This is National Park Diaries, where I tell you stories from the world's protected places. And today I want to answer the question of, should the Adirondacks be a national park? This topic was actually selected by my patrons over at patreon.com/nationalparkdiaries. And I knew as soon as they voted on it that this wouldn't be an easy question to answer. This park is complicated. There's a lot to unpack here, a lot going on. And your answer to this question probably depends on your own values, your own belief system, what you think a park is or should be. So let me tell you what I found and how I feel about this topic. Then let me know down in the comments what you think about the idea of an Adirondack National Park. Okay, first off, for those of you who don't know, the Adirondack Park is a state park in New York. It takes up pretty much the entire northeastern part of the state. Remember, it's 6 million acres, but it's unique in that the park contains both public and private land. And I'm not just talking about a few inholdings here. Like, almost half of the land in the park is privately held. And that obviously makes managing that land difficult. There isn't just a single landowner here, so you can't just apply a blanket set of rules and regulations like you would at a normal park. You have to craft a system that accommodates the interests of the public and the private landowners. That means preserving the natural character of the area, while at the same time still facilitating sustainable economic development. It's, the classic tension between man and the environment. This is a problem we've been trying to solve for a long time now. We have to make a living and maintain our quality of life, while still preserving the land so it can continue to provide us that quality of life into the future. Any system that attempts to achieve this balance is going to have its issues, and the Adirondacks are no different. But to understand how that system operates today, it helps to understand how it first came about. So in pre-colonial America, this area that we now call the Adirondacks was part of the territory for the Mohawk tribe, who were part of the Iroquois Confederacy. The Iroquois were known as people who live in the longhouse because of the types of dwellings they built. But more than that, they saw the world around them as one great longhouse. This land provided them with food and shelter, but it was also intertwined into their culture and identity. They had a deep connection to it. The Great Longhouse was their home. But when European settlers arrived, they had a different construct of what this land meant to them. It was more of an adversarial relationship. Forest and wilderness were scary. They were foreign and dangerous. This land was to be conquered and subjugated for the benefit of the people who settled it, which is pretty much exactly what they did. By the end of the American Revolution, the Iroquois had been removed from their great longhouse, and all the land that was previously held by the Crown, the King of England, now came to be owned by the state of New York. It was about 7 million acres in all, a considerable amount of land. But New York had a lot of debt from the war, so they started selling off a bunch of land in order to finance it. Now, people did try and settle this newly purchased Adirondack land, but this area is not great for agriculture, and a lot of northeastern farmers had long bypassed New York on their way to farm in the much more arable Midwest and Great Plains. So what really took hold in the Adirondacks was extractive industry: logging, trapping, hunting, and mining. Wealthy landowners came to own large tracts of Adirondack forests, which they used to fuel the booming post-war economy. This went on for most of the 19th century. But there were a couple of parallel developments in this century that start to show us the very beginnings of conservation in the Adirondacks. First, you've got the Romantics, writers like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. and painters like Thomas Cole begin to write about and depict nature not as something to be scared of, but something to be admired. They painted it as a foil to the ills of urban life, and portrayed nature and wilderness as a place of escape and refuge. And the Adirondacks were kind of at the vanguard of this. Writers, painters, philosophers, and romantics of all kinds were consistently amazed that the eastern United States still had this huge, largely forested place still remaining. And as their stories and travels reached the general public, tourism to the Adirondacks started to pick up as well, especially after the Civil War. So you have people coming to visit the Adirondacks, now armed with this fledgling idea of romantic nature, combined with the still ongoing activities of the extractive industries. The story of conservation here is largely a different version of this tension at different points in time. Except conservation is basically still a fledgling movement at this time. There wasn't overwhelming support for preservation of wild places, and it certainly didn't have the sort of mainstream support of today's conservation efforts. So the first calls for conservation of the Adirondacks are actually still in service of industry. This guy named Verplanck Colvin starts going to the Adirondacks in the 1870s and starts advocating for their protection. Now, if you read his writing, he does talk about the value of this area as wild and natural, but his motives for preservation are still largely commercial. He actually says that, quote, "the interests of commerce and navigation demand that the forest should be preserved," end quote. He notices that clear-cut forests erode very easily, and their topsoil washes away into rivers and streams. He's worried that if this continues unabated, the lifeblood of the New York economy, the Erie Canal, might silt up and threaten the livelihood of the entire state. I mean, this was one of the most important navigation corridors in the nation, if not the world at the time. And the thought of its productivity being hampered in any way didn't sit well with state officials. His argument eventually wins over the state legislature, and in Chapter 283 of the Laws of 1885 of New York State, they create the Adirondack Forest Preserve. Technically, the Catskills are part of this legislation too, but I just want to focus on the Adirondacks here. This is actually the first time we see the famous Forever Wild language in legislation concerning Adirondack preservation, but I'll touch on that more in a minute. The other thing here is that the New York State Forest Preserve only concerns state-owned public land. Even today, the Forest Preserve still only refers to the state-owned forest land within the park boundaries. The park itself wouldn't be created until 1892. State officials knew that the forest preserve by itself was not going to be enough to protect the watershed and thus the state economy, so they passed the Adirondack Park Enabling Act. This is where the famous blue line boundary first comes into play, but even then, only public land is included as part of the park. Private land within the blue line boundary is not part of the Adirondack Park at this time. The idea was that over time, the state would acquire that private land and create a unified, coherent state park. But incredibly, the Adirondack Park legislation actually weakened the park's preservation initiatives. It gave the State Forestry Commission permission to sell or lease state land, something opponents worried would quickly be abused by powerful forestry interests. And this is where we return to the concept of forever wild. Just 2 years after the park was established, in 1894, Forever Wild became enshrined in the New York State Constitution, giving the Adirondack Park one of the strongest conservation mandates in the world. Even to this day, Article 14, Section 1 of the New York State Constitution reads, quote, "The lands of the state, now owned or hereafter acquired, constituting the forest preserve as now fixed by law, shall be forever kept as wild forest lands. They shall not be leased, sold, or exchanged, or be taken by any corporation, public or private, nor shall the timber thereon be sold, removed, or destroyed." That one sentence, that tiny little clause, gives state land in the Adirondacks an unmatched level of protection, both at the time and still today. Even though this entire preservation effort was originally intended to preserve industrial interests, as the years have worn on and our society's feelings towards conservation have matured, the Forever Wild clause now stands as the linchpin of conservation in the Adirondacks. But what about that private land? Remember, it's still not part of the Adirondack Park when the Forever Wild clause is adopted. The state legislature would amend that in 1912 when they officially declared private property within the park boundary to be part of the Adirondack Park, but on the ground, this didn't really change anything. Private land was still private, public land was still public, and the only thing that unified them was a blue line. For the state's part, they were still planning on acquiring this land to unify the Adirondack Park under public ownership. But land isn't cheap, especially for an individual state to acquire, and especially not for a park the size of the Adirondacks. So private land and how to incorporate it into the landscape of a public park becomes the defining issue of the Adirondack Park in the 20th century. This is also where the question of should the Adirondacks be a national park first arises. See, throughout the 20th century, the Adirondacks continued to become a popular tourist destination. The mass production of the automobile made the region more accessible than ever, and as a result, the private land in the park came under more pressure than ever to be developed. The idea gets floated around that to protect the Adirondacks, maybe it should be a national park. So New York State commissions a study in 1967 to explore this very possibility. And actually, that study does recommend creation of a national park. It would be 1.7 million acres, 1.1 of which was already owned by the state, leaving 660,000 or so to be acquired for the new national park. The study estimated that the federal government could acquire 90% of the private land it needed within 15 years at a cost of just over $51 million, which they estimated would actually save the state of New York $13 million annually, while bringing in an additional $136 million in tourism revenue by the year 1983. Now, I've read this report. I'll link it in the description if you want to read it also. It's not actually that long. And its main justification, its main reasoning for recommending a national park is to protect the area from what it calls, quote, economic opportunities and pressures. It correctly pointed out that most of the park was privately owned and that should the economic forces at play be followed to their logical conclusion, the natural value of the area would be destroyed. So they're like, yeah, this is worthy of a national park status, and we recommend the Adirondack National Park. And let me tell you what, people did not like this. People who were more pro-economic development and tourism and people who were more pro-conservation both agreed on this. But it was also clear that something needed to be done. The report was right. If left unchecked, tourism and economic development would threaten the natural character of the area. The question was just how much, and could they guide that development toward areas where it was more acceptable? They needed a system that tried to balance the interests of both private landowners and the general public. So in 1971, New York State creates the Adirondack Park Agency, the APA. This agency would be, and still is, responsible for planning and guiding development to areas where it is most appropriate, while at the same time minimizing the impact to the natural environment in areas where it is not. Now, to be clear, the APA is not a management agency. State lands in the park are still managed by the New York State Department of Environmental Control. The APA is a land use planning agency. They have two plans which govern land use in the park. State land falls under the State Land Master Plan and falls into one of 5 land use categories, including more than 1 million acres of wilderness. Private land, though, the thing that really dominates the conversation, was similarly divided into 6 land use categories, each with varying levels of allowable development. This is basically like zoning, but for nature. Now, to be clear, it is very much the intention of the Adirondack Park Agency Act to preserve the natural character of the Adirondack Park. The people of New York have pretty consistently supported Adirondack preservation. But the act wants to do so in a way that allows the communities in the park to continue, well, being communities, to allow people to make a life here for themselves and their families. This is from the Citizen's Guide to the Adirondack Park Agency Land Use Regulations. I'll link it in the description below. Quote, "The act contemplates that the park will retain its natural open space character while communities in the park continue to grow in an environmentally sensitive manner." Now, that's all well and good, but does this work? Are the Adirondack Park Agency regulations retaining the park's natural open space character while still allowing communities to grow in an environmentally sensitive manner? Well, I think that depends on who you ask. At the beginning of this video, I told you that your answer to the question of should the Adirondacks be a national park probably depended on your own set of values and beliefs about what a park should be. I think the same holds true here. So let me tell you what I think and why my answer to should the Adirondacks be a national park is no. For me, this system, regardless of the regulations on paper, represents a commitment. A commitment from the people of New York and the communities of the Adirondacks to living harmoniously within their natural environment. We can talk about whether the regulations are too lenient or too stringent, whether they give too much to developers or they lock up too much of the land. But the point is, they're trying. We've lost something, it seems, in our modern world of seeing ourselves as part of the natural world. We view it as otherness, as not for us, as being distinctly separate from the human experience. But as I always advocate for on this channel, we are not separate from the natural world. We are part of it, and seeing ourselves that way, believing in this idea, is such a powerful tool in correcting so many of the environmental mistakes we have made, which is why I don't think the Adirondacks should be a national park. Not because it's unworthy or not scenic or valuable enough, but because by its very nature, the system that has been created here is designed to allow humans and nature to coexist. I choose to see the hope in that. I choose to believe in that future. Thank you for watching. Let me know your thoughts on the Adirondacks down below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more park stories. Check out my Patreon. Follow me on Instagram for life and channel updates, and I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.